Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to the most advanced civilizations ever seen. Great empires, the Egyptians, Hittites, Mycenaeans, had built trade networks, developed written languages, and mastered bronze working. Their cities were wealthy, their armies powerful. Then within a generation, almost all of it vanished. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. The palace bureaucracies of the Mycenaean world ran on meticulous record-keeping. At Pylos, scribes documented everything from chariot wheels to jars of olive oil, pressing wet clay with symbols only trained specialists could read. This administrative complexity was typical of Bronze Age powers, and it would prove a vulnerability when systems began to fail. The wealth of this interconnected world depended on bronze itself, an alloy of copper and tin. Cyprus supplied much of the copper, its smiths casting distinctive oxide-shaped ingots recognised across the Mediterranean. These standardised shapes allowed traders from different cultures to conduct business efficiently, even when they shared no common language. International commerce flowed through checkpoints like Egyptian frontier fortresses, where scribes taxed and recorded foreign goods. Grain shipments left Egypt to feed distant populations facing shortages. Diplomatic correspondence travelled between royal courts written in Akkadian, the shared language of diplomacy. At Ugarit, scholars maintained archives in multiple scripts, facilitating communication between powers that might otherwise have remained rivals. Military technology reflected this interconnected age. Hittite armories stockpiled weapons by the thousands. Egyptian workshops assembled lightweight war chariots. As darkness fell over ports like Byblos, beacon fires guided ships carrying copper, tin, and grain. The system seemed unshakable. The first signs of trouble came not from any enemy, but from the sky. Across Anatolia, rainfall patterns shifted dramatically around 1200 BCE. What had been productive farmland became dusty wasteland within a few seasons. The Hittite heartland, dependent on predictable harvest to feed its armies and population, suddenly found itself unable to grow enough food. Granaries that once held surplus for lean years were scraped empty. Drought in one region might have been manageable, but the interconnected Bronze Age economy meant failure cascaded across borders. Refugees began moving towards cities that still had food, straining resources and social order. City gates that once welcomed traders now turned away desperate families. Surviving letters from this period reveal the growing panic among elites. One Hittite queen wrote urgently to Egypt begging for grain shipments, warning that her land faced starvation. Markets that had bustled with international trade fell quiet. Soldiers, the backbone of state power, saw their rations cut. Hungry armies are dangerous armies, and maintaining loyalty became increasingly difficult. Infrastructure began failing. Fortifications that required constant maintenance started crumbling as resources were diverted to more immediate needs. Priests examined sacrificial entrails searching for divine explanations, finding only ill omens. The fishing catches that had supplemented diets grew smaller as marine ecosystems also shifted. Storehouses of remaining grain required armed guards, a sign of how far trust had deteriorated. Then came reports from the frontiers, strange movements across the landscape, unfamiliar ships on the horizon. Coastal watchtowers spotted vessels unlike anything in the merchant fleets. These ships carried not traders but warriors, and behind them, entire families with all their possessions. The Sea Peoples had arrived, and they were not coming to trade. The Sea Peoples were not a single nation, but a confederation of displaced groups. The Peliset, Jekka, Shekelesh, and others, whose original homelands may have included the Aegean, Western Anatolia, and Mediterranean islands. Climate collapse and political chaos had set them in motion, and they moved not as raiders but as migrants seeking new lands to settle. They brought their families, their livestock, and everything they owned. For cities like Ugarit, this was catastrophic. The great trading port had survived for centuries through commerce and diplomacy, but it had no answer for an enemy that wanted not tribute but territory. The harbour that had welcomed ships from Egypt, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia became a scene of destruction. The last known letter from Ugarit, found where it was abandoned, begged Cyprus for ships to defend against attackers already at the gates. Help never came. The Hittite Empire, the superpower that had contested Egypt for dominance of the Near East, fared no better. Weakened by drought and internal strife, the Hittites assembled their remaining forces for a desperate defence. The battles that followed are poorly documented, but the outcome speaks clearly. Hattusa, one of the ancient world's greatest capitals, was abandoned and eventually burned. The empire that had stood for 5 centuries simply ceased to exist. Only Egypt remained strong enough to mount serious resistance. Rameses III recognised the existential nature of the threat and mobilised his kingdom for total war. Shipyards worked through the night building new vessels. Infantry and chariot divisions gathered in the delta. The pharaoh understood what was at stake. The sea peoples had already destroyed civilizations older and once more powerful than his own. Egypt would either stop them or join the fallen. The battles that saved Egypt were among the most consequential in ancient history. In a naval engagement in the Nile Delta, Egyptian tactics proved devastatingly effective. Rather than boarding enemy vessels in traditional fashion, Rameses ordered his ships to ram and capsize the sea people's boats, drowning warriors weighed down by their armour. The survivors were captured, and the invasion fleet was destroyed. On land, the confrontation was equally decisive. The sea peoples had formed their ox carts into a defensive circle, a migration formation that doubled as a battlefield fortification. Egyptian chariots and massed archers broke this formation with coordinated volleys and flanking manoeuvres. The victory was complete enough that Rameses commissioned enormous relief carvings at his mortuary temple, documenting every detail, from capsizing ships to bound prisoners presented before the throne. But Egypt's triumph masked a deeper truth. The world that had sustained Egyptian prosperity was gone. Tribute from former trading partners arrived in diminished quantities, if at all. The great powers that had once competed and cooperated with Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the merchants of Ugarit, had ceased to exist. Egypt had won the battle but inherited a shattered international system. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces fell one after another, under circumstances that remained debated. Pylos burned so quickly that scribes were still writing tablets when the flames reached them. At Mycenae itself, the great citadel sealed its gates against a threat that eventually proved unavoidable. Workshops were abandoned mid-production. Families buried their bronze valuables hoping to return for them. Many never did. Survivors fled across the sea to Cyprus, Crete, or anywhere that might offer safety. The palaces that had dominated the Aegean for centuries became empty ruins within a single generation. The collapse left behind a world transformed almost beyond recognition. The great citadels of Mycenaean Greece stood empty, their lion gates guarding nothing but weeds and fading memories. On the Canaanite coast, the people once called Sea Peoples, now known to history as Philistines, built new settlements blending their Aegean traditions with local customs. The raiders had become settlers, and their descendants would become one more thread in the region's complex cultural fabric. Not everyone fell. Assyria, protected by distance and geography, recorded the catastrophe with the detached interest of survivors, documenting a plague that spared their house. Their scribes noted the disappearance of trading partners and diplomatic contacts, their tablets becoming some of our best evidence for the scope of the disaster. But even Assyria contracted, waiting centuries before expanding again. From the ruins, something new slowly emerged. Iron, once a novelty metal inferior to bronze, became essential when the tin trade collapsed. Local smiths learned to work this abundant ore, and iron tools spread even to villages that had never seen bronze. The Phoenicians, rebuilding from devastated port cities, would carry their alphabet and their ships farther than Bronze Age merchants ever dreamed. The stories of the Lost Age survived as oral poetry, eventually becoming the epics that would inspire civilizations the Bronze Age kings never imagined. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that complexity is fragile. Systems that seem permanent can unravel within a single generation when drought, migration, disrupted trade, and internal weakness align. Yet it also shows humanity's resilience. The survivors adapted, simplified, and eventually rebuilt. The stars that watched the palaces burn continued shining over new villages, new kingdoms, and new possibilities rising slowly from the ruins of the old world.